and welcome to Early Childhood Mental Health Chronicles. I am host, Tena Sloan. This episode is titled A Tale of Two Crises, Racial Injustice Towards Black Boys and Black Men, from Preschool Expulsion to Police Killing, a conversation with Dr. Walter Gilliam of Yale University. I am so excited about Dr. Gilliam being here as a guest. Dr. Gilliam is a professor of child psychiatry and psychology at Yale University Child Study Center and director of the Edward Ziegler Center in Child Development and Social Policy. Dr. Gilliam has conducted extensive research involving early childhood education and intervention policy analysis, ways to improve the quality and mental healthiness of pre-kindergarten and child care services, early childhood mental health consultation, early childhood expulsions and suspensions, and the impact of early childhood education programs on children's school readiness. Dr. Gilliam is the chair of the committee on the board of 0 to 3. He is on the board of directors of Child Care Aware of America and the Irving Harris Foundation. He is a member of the Scholastic National Advisory Council, and he is a research fellow of the National Institute for Early Education Research. There are so many more professional accolades that could be shared about Dr. Gilliam. The final words I'll say about Dr. Gilliam is that he is a husband, a father, and a strong child advocate. I love his sense of humor, and he is the most gracious, humble, kindest, and the most polite gentleman. It must be his Kentucky roots. Welcome, Dr. Gilliam. Thank you for joining me today. It's so wonderful to see you.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's so great to see you.
Yeah, it's been quite some time since we've spoken. So yeah. It's wonderful to talk to you today.
When was the last time? When were we last together in the same place?
I think the last time we were actually together in the same place was May of 2018, and that's actually when we met, but we've had several phone calls since then, but I think it's been maybe about a year or so.
Well, we gotta fix that. Hopefully once we get past COVID, hopefully when we get COVID under control and we all do what we need to be doing to get it under control, we'll be able to get together again and be in the same place.
Yes, actually, you know what? I think that I was totally wrong. I actually saw you at 0 to 3 in Florida. So that was then, October or November of last year. So it actually hasn't been that soon, but still too long.
Well, I understand. Like, it's in the COVID days, it's like hard for me to keep track of. Like something could be last week or last month or last year or a decade ago, and it all just kind of feels the same anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have time keeping track of time.
Yeah, the sense of time has definitely changed. So in your intro, I've been referring to you as Dr. Gilliam, but we've known each other for a few years now. You call me friend, which is totally amazing and crazy to me because I respect and admire you like crazy. So is it okay if moving forward, since we're friends and all, can I just call you Walter?
Absolutely. I would love that. That would make me feel honored.
Okay, perfect. So I don't call you Dr. Gilliam when we're talking. So, but I did want to honor and respect you and ensure that who's listening, that they can really get a sense of all that you have contributed to humanity and doing that through all of your work that supports our youngest and our most vulnerable members of our community. And that's our babies and our infants, our toddlers, and our preschoolers and their families and the people that care for them.
Well, my dear friend, I don't care what you call me as long as you call me frequently.
Okay, that's awesome. I'll do that. You heard it, everyone. He said I can call him anytime. Frequently, not anytime, frequently. There we go. All right.
Well, so anytime and frequently, both.
So when we met in Sacramento, that was May 2018, and it was at a roundtable event organized by Cadango, and that's their early education organization where I work. I'm the vice president of early childhood mental health consultation there, and you were our featured speaker there, and you were discussing your work. There were, at that roundtable, there were ECE leaders across the state of California, including the California Department of Education. And we were all there to discuss a bill that Cadango was in the process of being passed. That was AB 2698, which would allow funding for early childhood mental health consultation. So in our state infant, toddler, and preschool program. So that really is near and dear to your heart. I know that mental health consultation, and you were there to, help us think about how do we implement this and get it passed into law. So that's actually when we met.
Yeah, I remember that very well. I was so delighted that Cadango put that together, and it was just such a lovely opportunity to have a discussion about this in Sacramento, like you mentioned, and Blanca Rubio,
Yes.
representative there, was there speaking. And from the Department of Education in California, we had several people there, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
we're also
Lots
there.
of people.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was a pretty packed event of people who just care deeply for children and families and want all of our children to be able to have the best set of opportunities available to them. And
Yes.
the enemy to opportunity is kicking children out of opportunities. And
Yes.
that's what we were there to talk about, how to stop doing that.
Yes. So that actually leads me to how I actually first got introduced to you and your work. It was actually from a personal experience that had happened a year prior. So my daughter was not even 3 years old. She was only about 2.5. She was attending a private preschool, and this was her first out of home care experience. And she had only been in this early care and education. It was a private preschool for about 3 months. And she had consistent changes in her teachers. She had also lost her caregiver that had been helping me take care of her since she was 8 months old. And then there was all these transitions. So she had a week of having some real challenges and some real struggles because of all of the changes. And so I got the call to come in and talk with the director and the assistant director, and they were telling me how that they were concerned and that she was aggressive and that they were going to really be keeping, a strong eye on her. So within a few days, I was being called into their office to share with me that they did not believe that was the place for my daughter.
Wow.
And so, which already being in the work I was doing, which was helping to prevent this for other families, here I am as a mom. And I remember leaving that conversation, first of all, being like, not a problem. You don't want my child here. This is not the place for my child. And yet my heart hurt just in a way, and it ached for myself and for my daughter. She was the only child of color that was attending this private preschool. And so, for her at 2.5 to have that as a first experience was just, one of those realities that I faced, recognizing that as a young Black child, that I can't protect her from those things. But man, at 2.5, that was just really, painful. And so I remember doing research and saying, what does it say out there about this? And then that's actually when I came across, I actually have the article right here, where it was talking about your research. And it was talking about, I'm trying to remember, it was an NPR article. And it was, let's see, it was talking about bias isn't just a police problem, it's a preschool problem. And it was written by Corey Turner. And they cited your research. And I remember the day that I went to go pick up her stuff because they didn't let her back. I had printed off that article and I had it in my folder, and I was like, I'm going to leave it for these people so that they can, read this. And so that was actually the first time I heard your name, and it was the first time that I heard that research. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me and my daughter. And it's not right. So that's really how I first, and then I got to meet you, a year later.
I had not heard that story from you before. That article came out September 2016. Is
Yes.
when that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Exactly.
Yeah, I had not heard the story that you had told me before about your daughter.
Yeah. So, but today is August 2nd, 2020. We're several months into COVID-19. And since the brutal police killing of George Floyd, we're in the midst of the aftermath of that civil unrest, all the outrage due to these countless murders of Black people, mostly Black men, by police over the years, and the lack of injustice for this death. So this is the context in which our conversation is happening. So what I'll do is just sort of start off with how has this period of time impacted you, and what have you been feeling and what have you been thinking?
Wow, it's a hard question. An awful lot, I guess part of what I felt was, my God, here we go again. Part of it was, I, I can't believe that this is happening yet again, and that it's just so brutal and so inhumane and so right in the middle of the public street, like a lynching. I I felt I like I had a hard time coming to grip with what I was seeing there. My wife had a hard time, especially the with hearing Mr. Floyd crying out for his mother. And I think that affected her as a mother. When she heard that, she heard a cry for a mother, and she also heard a cry for mothers. And she wanted to answer it, And it reminded me of the work of looking at biases, but also, in some respects, we were doing research back in 2016, and we were doing research on implicit bias, and in a way, it now feels just like completely naive, to just be looking at just implicit bias when there's also so much explicit bias and just pure straight up racism out there too, and I still believe that implicit bias is something important for us to be looking at, that some of the times our behaviors can have racist outcome even if there isn't overt racist intent involved. But that doesn't overcome the fact that there is also racist intent out there, and it's emboldened now, and it's been given opportunity. It has places to live on the internet. It finds safe harbor in a way that it didn't find before. I mean, those kind of thoughts flooded into my mind. The title of that Corey Turner article that you mentioned before, that bias isn't just a police problem, it's also a preschool problem. I mean, that flooded in too.
Mm.
You know, Mr. Floyd, before he was the age he was there in that video, he was a preschooler. You know, and what was that like for him then? You know, what's this like for the children of many men and sometimes women, Breonna Taylor, who go through this kind of stuff? And what's that like for them? You know, all this kind of stuff was going through my mind. And then over time, of course, when there were a lot more, the demonstrations started, and they happened very fast. And they built very fast. And it covered the nation, and it spilled out across the globe. And people were protesting police brutality and the murder of George Floyd in the street, all over the world. And part of my thoughts were also around this feels a little different than it felt before. And I don't know exactly why. I don't know if it was because there was so much attention that had been placed on this because of COVID, because people were home and paying more attention, maybe because they were less distracted by the less meaningful things that we find in our daily lives to distract us. I didn't know if it was because COVID itself had for several months highlighted the disparities that already exist, you know, because some people are hit harder by COVID. Some people have more pain because of COVID. Those same people are more likely to have fewer resources, fewer safety nets to be able to deal with that pain. And in many cases, those people who have been harmed by COVID the most, with the fewest resources, are harmed by it because they're the essential workers out there putting their own lives and health on the line in order to serve the needs of people like me who can sit at home and do their job on Zoom. You know, and that was going through my mind too, you know, and like I was born in the 60s, but I don't really remember them very well. but I have colleagues and friends, including colleagues and friends of color, who do, and remember the marches and the demonstrations of the 60s, and they were saying this feels different. You know, it feels very different, and ask why. What's different about it? And they say the coalition feels different. There's more diversity of people who are out there protesting this. You know, I remember when there was a lot of media attention around children being separated from their families at the border and put in cages.
Yes.
And how some people were outraged by it. Many people thought that this was the right thing to do, unfortunately. And most people seemed to be, I see the cat.
Yeah.
And most people were, it seemed like, just totally apathetic to it. Like it just didn't really matter to them one way or the other.
Yeah, which is so sad.
Yeah, that's, well, you know, what is that's the silence, right? That's that deafening silence of good people, right? So
the indifference.
The indifference, the apathy, the not caring, and a lot of that changed at one particular moment when it came to babies in cages. It changed when an audio tape came out, when an audio recording came out of children crying. You remember that? The audio.
I can't forget that.
Yeah, it came out and it was everywhere, and people could hear the cries, and it created this visceral response, a response that didn't go through the mind in terms of like, what does this mean? And then
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling about it. It just went
Mm-hmm.
straight
Right
through the
there.
heart, straight through it. No, none of this anymore, And so it
Mm-hmm.
just was like I hear babies crying, and that it just gets your attention. And and in a way, we had an element of that, I think, when Mr. Floyd was killed.
Mm-hmm.
You could see it right there, and you could hear it right there, and you could see what this felt like, or must have felt like for him, and the
Yeah.
terror of it, and the indifference. But
Mm-hmm.
also, there were quite a few people there that were calling for the police to stop doing
Stop.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like a lot of people were calling for the police to stop, except for other members of the police. They weren't.
Mm-hmm.
They were just kind of following along. And I mean, even the 911 operator ended up contacting a supervisor saying, I've got something on camera here and it looks like it's not going right. This looks really bad. You need to intervene. And the intervention never happened. That something feels different about the protests now, that may have something to do perhaps with how the moment and how what happened spoke to people and how they could actually hear it and
Mm-hmm.
how they could feel it because they saw it and heard it and didn't
Yes.
just have to think about it,
Mm-hmm.
and but whatever it is that caused that, the coalition, according to my friends who remember the 60s instead of just read about it or saw it on
Mm-hmm.
TV like me, they say that whatever it is that caused it, it just seems like a much more diverse group of people. I remember seeing on the news not too long ago in Portland, Oregon, the wall of moms. Did you see that?
Mm, I did not see that.
Yeah, it was mothers of all races, mostly white, that joined together and locked arms and marched in front of the protesters as mothers to protect the protesters.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
We're talking about
I
black.
read about it. I didn't see it. Yes.
Yeah, and then we had a wall of vets and a wall of dads.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's very different.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, I don't know if it's completely different in that I do know that there was a poor people's campaign that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was putting together. And it was a campaign that would pull together uh, black and brown and white people who felt that something was not working right in America, and that America was working more for those on top than those who were not on top. And the Poor People's Campaign didn't really get very far because that's when he was assassinated. And I also, you were asking my feelings about this, so I have my feelings about when the event happened, my feelings about what I was seeing with these marches, and then also the feeling when I put it all together, and realized, there's a lot of power in a diverse coalition of people saying, this
Yes.
is not right. This is not right. This is not right for some, which makes it not right for all.
For all. Right.
And at the same time, it's a moment that can't be squandered, and it's also a moment that we have to be very thoughtful and careful about, because others know that it's a powerful opportunity and moment too. When Dr. Martin Luther King was talking mostly about civil rights and the
Mm-hmm.
way in which we in this country were treating our our black friends and colleagues and neighbors, he was vilified by a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until he
Yes.
put together a coalition that included black and whites that they killed him, because there's power in that.
Yes.
And
There's power in that collective unity, like you said, across not just this is a poor people's problem, or this is just a black community problem, or it's a immigrant problem, but when it's a problem that all groups can get behind, and that it's a collective responsibility to respond and bring about change. And that does feel like there's some momentum around that. That the last time I remember experiencing that in my lifetime was 9/11. And so yeah, there's something super meaningful to me about that. And it's been something that I've been talking a lot at where I work at Cadengo around having this healing centered perspective. And this healing centered perspective means that it's not only looking at the people impacted as only their responsibility to sort of heal these wounds, but that it requires a collective acknowledgement of the wounding, of the disparities, of the pain. And then it's not just that person that's impacted, their responsibility for healing themselves, but it's a collective responsibility of the community around that person to also take responsibility for changing the conditions that allow for trauma to happen, changing the conditions that then allow for the fullest of that person to emerge and to be able to see that human being, that community as wounded and also whole with these assets and strengths and all this beauty that is worthy to allow to be able to be seen and to be supported and being brought forward, and not only treated as the victim impacted and we're focusing on the symptoms and the behaviors, right? Like we need the whole spectrum of that perspective. And so I sort of feel like if we can continue to look at what's happening now, and then I want to really zero in on these experiences are starting in their earliest period of people's lives. And that's in infant toddler programs, that's in preschool, programs. And my hope, and maybe this conversation will be a trigger, that there'll be enough people that will hear that babies are being kicked out of preschool, that the outrage around that is mobilized to bring about change in the same way that we're really hoping will continue, and are really hopeful and believing that what's happening with George Floyd in response to the universal impact that seemed to cross color lines in some ways, racial lines, cultural lines, that also can be ignited when we think about babies being told, you're excluded from here. We don't want you here. So let's talk a little bit about that. Babies and little human beings are being kicked out of preschool. And your research has showed, there's particular babies and young kids that's happening to.
Yeah. We first released findings on that back in 2005, like 15 years ago. Was when we first started looking at that issue. We were doing a study on just preschool programs in general, and I couldn't help but notice that many of the children who were being sent to the Yale Child Studies Center, I work at Yale in the School of Medicine, and many young children, preschool age children, were being sent there for an evaluation because they had been kicked out of a preschool program. or they were told, the parents were told that if they don't go to a place like Yale and get an evaluation, that they will kick them out of the preschool program. And so I just started seeing a lot of this happening, and I tried to find out if this was something that was common, because I'd never heard of kids getting kicked out of preschool programs, like fully kicked out. I mean, I'm not talking about like, you know, suspended for a day or two or sent to the principal's office. I'm told like don't come back, you know, at 3 or younger, you know, and I that just seems just bizarre. so I tried to see, you know, does this happen? And I couldn't find anything on it at all, like nothing. And so since we were getting ready to do this big nationwide study anyway of preschool programs, I just threw in a couple of additional questions. And then ultimately that's what drove the entire study afterwards. That was the big finding, was these extra questions that were just thrown into an existing study simply because there was the problem staring us in the face, just right there, you know, and absolutely nothing written on it. You know, and we found that children in state-funded preschool programs, and these are some of the better resource programs, you know, and in these preschool programs that had state dollars and state funding, in many cases ran out of state departments of education, were expelling children at a rate of more than 3 times that of grades K through 12 combined.
Combined, which is...
It was mind-boggling. And it was just amazing that it was that much. And then when you look at like childcare programs that aren't ran out of state departments of education, it's about 13 times, you know, just incredible, you know. So the part of what was surprising about it was just how frequent it happened. And then the other part was just how little anyone had ever heard of it, you know, except of course for the parents, except of course for the teachers who end up resorting to it in many cases because they don't know what else to do.
Yes.
You know, they don't have supports, you know, and so you know, I didn't know whether I was more shocked by the rate at which it was happening or more shocked by how invisible it seemed to be, you know. And then it occurred to me, well, you know, there's no place that you can go to buy a bumper sticker that says "Proud mother of an expelled preschooler," you know.
No.
And
those don't exist, clearly.
They don't make those. There's no demand.
They don't make those, yes.
There's no
one
demand.
wants to highlight the fact that happened.
Yeah, the teachers don't either.
No.
You know, so this is one of those instances where, of course, it makes sense that very few people had ever heard of it outside of the instance of it happening, which is because, you know, there's nobody proud of it. You know, but it still causes harm. You know, and it still causes damage to children. You know, we're talking about children who, you know, literally kicked out of school before they even get to school. You know, it's called preschool because it's preschool. You know, you're kicked out of school before you even get to school. You know, right. Like what a rough way. Can you imagine a harder way to start your school experience than feeling like you've already been told that school is not the right place for you? Because we've collectively decided that when you were 3, you know, and or for a parent, well, I guess you would know what it feels like because you've been there, you said, you know, for a parent to hear that, you know, like I as a parent myself, I just know that there's no worry greater than the parent worry about whether this world is going to be a safe place for my child, or whether my child's going to be okay, and whether my child's going to be accepted.
Yes.
You know, and to hear, not only is your child not accepted, we don't want your child here anymore.
It's painful. It's very painful, and I'm a more resourced parent. And I had the resources to be able to say, not here, and I'm going to go find another place, and was able to get her into another place that embraced her. And I remember being so anxious about what was going to happen this time around. But I will be forever grateful to Miss Janet, who was her first teacher after that, who lovingly refers to my daughter Avery as her spicy pickle. And it could not be a better description of my sweet girl, who was also spicy. And so, but there was this relief. There was this gratitude that I cannot put words to, that I could go to work and I knew, because I had seen it, I had felt it in the way they also embraced me. I could see it in my daughter, that she would see her Miss Janet and run to her. But here was the thing that I remember seeing over and over again, was that I would see the back of my daughter embracing Miss Janet. So I could see Miss Janet's face as she was embracing my daughter. And she would close her eyes and I could see the love. And they would just embrace. And there's nothing better as a parent to be able to see this person loves my child. And that's what we want for all. That's what we want for all of our children. And she was her spicy pickle, right? Like, I'm not saying that she's, you know, sweet all the time. She's a young kid full of life with emotions, and, you know, and that was not going to define how they saw her and how they loved her and how they supported her, given that her emotional reactions were there for a reason, and they were there with her to support her with those emotions. And so, yeah, there's nothing like that as a mom, to see that.
Yeah.
And so to have had that experience, and then to sit across and be part of conversations that I'm trying to then prevent this, and to bridge the divide between the school and the home, so that another child, and I've been part of conversations, I've been witness to this happening to other families. And but being able to put myself in the shoes of the parent, but then being able to put myself in the shoes of the teachers who are up to here, and they're so stressed, not just stressed about that child, which is part of what they're feeling as stress, but there's all these other stressors in their life as a human being. There's stressors as a teacher that I can understand from an intellectual perspective how it would seem for the benefit of that teacher to not have that child there, because it appears to alleviate perhaps that overwhelmed feeling and that sense of stress. So I can empathize with both sides, and then feel like there's got to be something that can be there to support the teachers, and also can be there to support that child and that family member.
And that's what you do in your work.
And that's what I do in my work.
You are an early childhood mental health consultant, leading an early childhood mental health consultation system at Kadango.
Yes.
There to support the child, and there to support the provider, the child care provider, and there to support the family.
Mm-hmm. So I just was sort of like bringing to life what you were talking about, is that this is happening, and what's the impact when this happens. And it's devastating and it's painful on both sides. I don't think teachers come into this profession, they come in because they want to help children. So I don't think it feels good to them. I know that doesn't feel good to them, to then feel like I can't help this child, and the only thing I can do is send them away.
Yeah, I'm positive that it doesn't feel good to them. I've never met child care provider, preschool teacher, who says that they enjoy expelling kids and kicking kids out of school and out of child care programs. As a matter of fact, I have met several who tell me that they cry about it,
Mm-hmm.
that they just don't know what else to do,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't have the supports that they need, and shame on us collectively for 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 underpaying and then under supporting these child care providers and preschool teachers. I mean, we pay them horribly, and then we ask them what kind of supports they need, and they say they need supports on things like managing challenging behaviors or understanding children's stressors, and we give them more pamphlets on curricula. Like, we don't give them what they ask for. We don't give them the supports they need in many cases, and we're paying them absolutely terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I, the least we can do, if we're not going to pay them well, is give them the supports they need in order to feel successful. I'm quite sure that they go into this line of work not thinking that they're going to make a bunch of money. They can't
No,
possibly be thinking that. They're
no,
going
they're
into
not thinking that.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
they go into it because they love children and they want to do what's right for kids, and they have a big heart, but then we don't give them the supports they need in order to be successful at it. And on top of that, we don't pay them well,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel for them too in all of this, like what you were saying, and I think that the very least that we can do, especially if we're going to be as successful as we've been becoming and getting more opportunities for early childhood programming for more children, is to make sure that we provide the supports necessary for all of our providers to be as successful as possible for all of those children.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of not giving them the supports that they need, growing the program out, and then having a lack of the resources needed to be able to support all of the children that are ultimately enrolled in the program. Early childhood education, as you know, it's not an easy job.
No.
It's not an easy gig to take care of your own child for a day. Try taking care of 20 of somebody else's. That's just not an easy
Mm-hmm.
gig, and
It's not.
to give them just no supports in it until they have to then eventually make some decisions that make them feel absolutely terrible about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I've become convinced that the measure of how much we really love our babies is how well we treat those who care for them.
Yes.
And if we don't treat those who care for our children very well, that's a statement about how much we really care for our children.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. I think the part that I also wrestle with is this the piece around implicit bias
Mm,
and its role in who gets kicked out and how that happens. And I find that this is the complexity of consultation work because there's so many factors that influence, that end up converging to create the conditions in which then children are removed. Um,
yeah.
and so can you say a little bit more and kind of talk about and I recognize what you were, I'm like returning back to what you were sharing earlier in terms of, and it was sort of one of my questions that I've been, pondering when you were saying that maybe calling it implicit bias or I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can even share more about, you were saying sort of feeling naive about that. I'm not quite sure what you meant by that earlier, in the context of where we're now talking about this systemic racism, and we can't assume that in any of our broader systems that they're immune or somehow not, um, unintentionally, maybe in some ways intentionally, but mostly I think unintentionally in many cases, sort of perpetuating that. So yeah, I think that's the complexity that I kind of want to wrestle with a little bit with you in terms of if you could just kind of talk first about implicit bias, what your research found, and then yeah, I have some questions that I've been rolling around in my head that I've been looking forward to asking you. But yeah, can you say more about the implicit bias piece that you found in your work
Sure.
related to expulsion?
Well, when we found that there was big disparities in who it is that's likely to get expelled, we found that boys are expelled at about 4 times the rate of girls. Our black children are expelled about twice the rate of white children, and that being a boy and being black was more than just 2 strikes. It really tended to multiply each other in terms of the likelihood of expulsion. And it became, very concerning for us to try to figure out, well, why is that? Why is it that our black children, and especially our black boys, are more likely to be expelled? And so I started looking more at research on bias and research on the way in which we look at children in different ways, depending on what expectations we might have for them. I started looking at other people's work in this and work on bias in policing programs and bias in K through 12 schools, and what we know about empathy and empathy across racial lines, and what we know about, how we view and create expectations for people that we don't know on the basis of our assumptions regarding some observable feature that we can see about them. So in the process of doing all that, we were basically just trying to figure out, well, why is it that some kids get more expelled than other children? Or stated a different way, why is it that in some cases a teacher can look at a challenging behavior, whatever that means, out of one child and say, that child needs support. That child needs some assistance. We need to, mobilize this program, or get these kind of supports on board, or maybe we need to contact the parent and see if we can get the parent to come in. We need to do something. This child needs some help. And some of the times we can see pretty much the exact same behavior out of a different child and say, that child needs to be contained, or that child needs to be expelled. We need to get rid of this child for the safety of the other kids,
Mm-hmm.
for my own sanity, you know? And what is it that makes that decision point where we can see something and say either that child needs assistance, or we can say that child needs something different than assistance. That child needs containment or removal. And I don't know what all the factors are that go into that decision making, but I do know this. I've certainly seen in my own professional life many instances where children are treated very differently for very similar behaviors. And the research bears that out, that many times children, especially black children, and especially our black boys, are more likely to be expelled or suspended or even sent to the principal's office for incredibly similar behaviors. That the only difference is that that behavior was with a white child, and like really good data behind this, really good science behind this, where like in one study by Russell Skiba, they were looking at school records, and they had all kinds of information about the child, and in it they had the child's race and ethnicity and gender and age, and what the child did that got the child in trouble, and what happened as a result. Did the child get sent to the principal's office, get in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, expelled? And what they did was his team masked over all the data except for just one variable. What did the
Mm-hmm.
child actually do?
Mm-hmm.
And had other teachers rate how severe was that? How bad is that behavior really, if that were to happen in your classroom? And then after they rated how severe it was, without knowing any factors about the child's race or ethnicity, or what happened to the child afterwards as a result of this, how the child was punished. They didn't know any of that. They just knew, what did the child just do?
Mm-hmm.
And when they put that information into the big data set and reanalyzed it, what they found was that even when the behavior problems were of the same degree of severity, the black child as opposed to the white child, and especially the black boy, was more likely to get sent to the principal's office, more likely to be suspended. If the suspension was a suspension, more likely for it to be out of school, more likely to be expelled,
Mm-hmm.
all for the same behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found myself concerned about, well, why is that we're finding these disparities with 3-year-olds? Like, what's really driving this? And
Right.
so one of the things that I started wondering is it possible that we just see more behavior problems out of some children because that's where we're looking? That if I'm looking for something and I only look to my left and I never look to my right, then I will only find it here, but I'll never even see it there because I'm not looking there. It's not where I expect it to be.
Mm-hmm.
There's an old joke or an old riddle about a man who was looking for his keys in a dark parking lot, and there's a street light that was on, and he's looking underneath the street light, and somebody comes up to him and says, can I help you? What are you doing? And he says, I'm looking for my keys. And he said, well, did you lose them here? And he said, no, I lost them over there. And the guy said, well, why are you looking for them here if you lost them over there? And he said, well, this is where the light is.
Mm-hmm.
And is it possible that maybe we find more challenging behaviors out of black kids because that's what we expect it to be? We
Well,
expect.
your research, you were able to see that that is what was happening, at least in the study that you did.
Yeah, well, that's what we were wondering, and so we tried to find a way to set up a study for it. And I know, one of the tricky things about implicit bias is you can't go up to people and say, implicit bias, these are the biases you have that you don't know that you have. Do you think you have them? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
well,
No.
you can't
Mm-hmm.
do that and get a reasonable, kind of answer out of that. So what we did was we went on the notion that the eyes don't lie, that the eyes will tell you what people are really thinking. Where you put your attention is what you're really thinking about. And so we set up an experiment where we had preschool teachers and child care providers, and we told them that told them a little lie here. We told them that this is a study to see how quickly they can find behavior problems. And that the secret to managing challenging behaviors in classrooms is seeing a behavior problem before it becomes too problematic. I want you to watch this video of 4 children in a preschool classroom. And I want you to watch what the children are doing. And anytime you see something that could become a behavior problem, I want you to hit this button on the side. That's what we told them.
Mm-hmm.
What we didn't tell them was this: there are no challenging behaviors in any of these videos. And the reason that we know this is because all 4 of these children are child actors that we've hired to sit at a table and play with Play-Doh.
Mm-hmm.
A black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And so I'm really not interested in how quickly you can find behavior problems because there aren't any to find. What I'm interested in is this: when I lead you to believe that a child's going to misbehave, who do you look at? Who do you look at first? Who do you look at the most? Who do you go back to because you must have missed something? In other words, if you weren't a child care provider, but instead you were a mall cop, who would you be following at the Gap right now? That's what we were really looking at. And what we found was that when we lead teachers to believe that a child's going to misbehave, they spend significantly more time watching black children, especially black boys. And we found that that is true regardless of the race of the teacher. White teachers did that, black teachers did that, brown teachers did that. And the notion here is because the bias is implicit.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing it maybe not even because you mean to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You're just doing it because you expect that that's where it's going to be, because of maybe the things you've heard or the things you think you've heard or the things you've seen, or the things you think you've seen, or whatever kinds of other media or public impressions that the rest of us all are consuming that tell us what to expect out of some people versus other people. And that when I lead you to believe that you need to find some challenging behaviors, and I lead you to believe that you're going to find some naughtiness, who do you zero in on? And pretty reliably, people zero in on the black child, especially black boys. And of course, going back to what I was saying before, if when you're looking for challenging behaviors, you're mostly just looking at black children, well, then you're going to find the black child's challenging behaviors. And you won't find the white child's because you weren't looking there. And that's ultimately what we found. We asked the teachers at the end of it who they think they were looking at the most. And it was interesting that the teachers actually felt that they were looking more at one group of kids than another. They felt that they were looking more at boys, regardless of race.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, it's not in other words, it wasn't that the teachers didn't think they had a bias. They actually did think they had a bias. They just thought they had a bias different than the one they actually had.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They thought they had an anti-boy bias when it comes to behavior problems, that boys misbehave. But what their eyes were telling us was something different.
Your research also showed a difference between 3 and 4-year-olds.
Yeah, that was in some of the earlier, when we did the study back in 2005, that 4-year-olds were more likely to be expelled than 3-year-olds, even when 3 and 4-year-olds were in the same classroom. We didn't know what to make of that, so we pulled together focus groups of child care providers and asked them, why is it that child care providers like you would report expelling more 4-year-olds than 3-year-olds if you had 3 and 4-year-olds together in the same classroom? And many of them thought about it, and they typically came to the same conclusion, which is that it's different if you have a challenging behavior in a child and the child is smaller, but if the child is bigger, then it just feels different if there's a challenging behavior. And so we said, well, what do you mean by that? And what they ultimately said was, well, if the child is smaller than the other children, then maybe no one will get as hurt by this child's challenging behaviors. But if the child is a big child, if the child looks bigger, then maybe somebody might get hurt. And that's an important thing that the teachers were saying to us, because what they were saying, if you listen carefully, is I'm not expelling on the basis of the child's behavior at all. I'm expelling on what I think might happen as a result of it, and how much risk there might be, and that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that it says that it's not really the child's behavior that's driving it, the expulsion, it's the adult's fear of what could happen as a result of it. Not what did happen, but what could happen. And the other part that's important to understand from it too, I think, is that what they're also saying is that if you look bigger, then you're going to look scarier to me in terms of keeping the other children safe. And we already knew from a lot of other research that many adults, when they're given pictures of children of a variety of different ages and races, that they tend to overestimate the age of black children by about 4.5 years. Many people think black children are significantly older than they really are, bigger, perhaps scarier. And so if you put it all together, we have a tendency to expel bigger children. We have a tendency to expel black children. We have a tendency to, at greater numbers, expel boys. So altogether, we have a bigger tendency to expel big black boys.
And when I hear that, and I hear that as an African American, and having experiences where there is a belief that you're black, then you are more scary because you're more likely to be aggressive. And if you're a black man, you're more likely to be aggressive. Therefore, you're a threat. Therefore, you're someone to be feared. Um, I remember working with an adoptive family, and they had adopted an African American
Mm.
boy, and they were Caucasian, and they loved him tremendously.
Mm.
And he had had a incredibly horrific early childhood. And so we were doing trauma work with the family dyadically. And, but I remember and again, I think this is, where it's so important that we're including the adults in any intervention that we're doing, even teachers, because here is a child that understandably was experiencing lots of fear and was reacting out of that fear, where he felt he needed to protect himself in situations now where that wasn't needed, but it had become an adaptive response. And yet, I remember the adoptive mom and the adoptive dad, particularly their mom, that there was this fear of him. And part of it had to do with the fact that he was a Black boy, and that he was bigger, that he was stronger, and that he could hurt her. And there was huge fear on both the parent side that he was going to grow up to be aggressive, that he was going to grow up and end up in jail. And I remember first being grateful and having this opportunity to come alongside them. But yet I did have this question that if they had adopted a white boy that was exhibiting the same, would they have the same level of fear? And I don't think that it was an unreasonable fear, because we're seeing that does happen. That you just have to be Black, and you just have to be a boy and a male, and you're perceived as threatening. And they're living in a society where we know that to be true. And yet I think there was another piece that was their own expectation of that behavior being more aggressive, or even labeling it as aggressive, when it was a child that would hit and kick and bite and maybe throw things. But I've seen other kids hit, kick, and bite, right? But there was a meaning and a fear attached to it. So I just sort of wonder also about that piece when it comes to the expectation and the level of fear and the level of threat that that young, big, Black boy triggers in those that are caring for him.
Yeah, yeah, I worry
Any
about.
reactions or thoughts to that?
Yeah, well, first off, I'm thrilled that they love this child and adopted this child and want to do what's best for this child. And I appreciate the complexity of the story that you just shared. And if I'm hearing you correctly, part of what they're expressing is a fear that the rest of the world will look at their big Black boy through big Black boy lenses and judge
Yes.
their big Black boy in terms of their expectations for what they would expect for a big Black boy.
Yes.
And the other part of what I was hearing was that they too were doing maybe a little bit of what they were afraid the world would do.
Yes. Yes.
And I think part of it has to do with the fact that, we all have biases inside of us,
Yes.
and some of the times those biases may not be biases we would want to be there, but they're still there, and if we are aware of our biases, then perhaps we can even use our biases to better understand how the rest of the world might view this child we care about. But if we're unaware of our biases, then not only can we not use our biases for good, but I guarantee you our biases will use us. And they'll make us behave and think in all kinds of different ways that are consistent with whatever that bias is. And the biases just end up inside of us just due to the world we live in and the messages that we receive and what we then, as a result, feel to be true about a group of people. And the problem about deciding what we feel to be true about a group of people is that it's oftentimes not true, either for the group or especially for individuals within the group. Even if it were true for the group, it would make it true for everybody, but we'll still yet use those biases to make these prejudgments. And on top of all of that, there tends to be a bias of heredity, a belief that to a large degree we are the products of the seeds that planted us, that we were planted, and that we will grow up to be the way our parents were, that we will think the way our parents thought, that we will behave the way our parents thought, that we will behave in a way that's consistent with the group from which we came, and whatever biases are attached to that group, and I guess to some degree, what might be inside of that, in the case that you're describing, is a fear that maybe their own parenting won't be strong enough to overcome the trauma that they had heard had happened in his family of origin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say that that's also what I hear when teachers hear for a particular child what is they've experienced, or they know that that child has come from a certain neighborhood or from a certain circumstance, that I mean, I understand it, where there is this fear like, well, that's not my role as a teacher, or there's nothing I can do. There's sort of like, in some situations, there's a sense of hopelessness and helplessness around, am I good enough? Do I have enough to be able to give something to this child that will help buffer or move that child in another direction? And several of the situations that I've been involved in where a child is being removed, that a part of it is the sense of helplessness and hopelessness and powerlessness. Therefore, if I can't do anything, then what's the point of having this child here? I can't affect them. I can't affect their situation. I can't get the parent to do the thing I think they should do. So there is this deep sense of, I think, a conflict inside of them, because when they come to the work, that's what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
They want to have a positive impact on a child. And when they perceive that that they can't do that, then I think, again, it goes back to that tremendous pain they end up feeling.
Yeah.
And perhaps every day as they encounter that child, that they're encountering their pain and their own sense of what it means to them to think that they can't make a difference in that child's life. So it's so complex. The consultation work is, yeah, it's this beautiful messiness, because it's about getting, I think, speaking the unspeakable,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
dealing with the thing that is,
Mm-hmm.
supporting the discomfort, because talking about biases and maybe the fact that I have one and that's influenced how I'm thinking and reacting towards this child, that is not conversations that people want initially to have. But ultimately, through the work, you do find for some that their desire to love and nurture a child overrides the discomfort, because they want to do whatever it takes to be there for that child, even if that means doing the work to see that child and that parent and that family differently.
Yeah.
and then being given the support and the tools to then implement certain practices along with that self-reflection to help them be successful and to have experiences of success and to help that child have experiences of success in the classroom.
Yeah, it's complicated stuff, isn't it? Because you have, when you're doing this mental health consultation, when you're working with childcare providers and preschool teachers around how they work with a child, and then also how they work with the family, then you're sort of like trying to juggle, okay, what is the child actually bringing, really?
Yes.
And then how is that being viewed and filtered by somebody who's watching what the child is bringing?
Yes.
And watching it through the lens of having to be responsible for that entire classroom.
Yes.
And having to, and I say this part less as a researcher and more as a former public school teacher myself.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers, I think the vast majority of them care deeply about each and every single child and want what's best for every single child. And at the same time, they have to also balance what they think might be in the best interest of the whole.
Yes.
And there's only so much teacher to go around.
Yes.
And so they're constantly making these kind of quick decisions on the basis of, what can I do for this child? But at the same time, I have the weight of this entire classroom's needs on my shoulder. And then you put into it also the biases that teacher might have regarding different children and what those children might bring. And then you have the family,
yes.
too, who typically love dearly this child and have all kinds of worries and anxieties. Mm-hmm. And they themselves may have lots of biases. Yes. About what to expect out of schools, mm-hmm. what to expect out of teachers like that one, mm-hmm. as opposed to teachers like this one, and all of these are painting the same reality picture that this child is bringing with completely different brushstrokes, and then you get this picture that's sometimes very hard to make a lot of sense out of until you sit down with all the groups that are involved and start to try to see things as clearly as possible by seeing things as much as we can through the lenses of others. Mm-hmm. Yes. And many of our parents did not have a good experience with school. School was not a place where they felt that their needs were met. Mm-hmm. Or they didn't have an experience that was good with every single teacher that they had. And sometimes they might have had experiences where they felt their needs weren't met, or that they were excluded, or that they were looked down upon, or that they were less important. And I'm not saying that's true for all of our parents, but it is true for many of them. And on the other side, people who become teachers, typically these were people, in many cases, who really thought school was spectacular. I mean, they loved it so much. Mm-hmm. They went to college for 4 years just so they can get back into it. Mm-hmm.
And stay in it.
And stay in it. And that's their whole life was in schools. You know what I mean? And so we are expecting conversations around children's challenging behaviors to happen in many cases between a group of parents who may not have thought that school was all that great, or may have actually thought that school was not a good place at all. Trying to have a conversation with people who think that school is the best thing ever. It's a wonderful thing. Right. And to have a productive conversation in the context of talking about a child's behavior, and in many cases, unfortunately, this is the first real conversation this teacher and parent have really had. Mm-hmm. But the first real conversation they've had is because the teacher felt the child was misbehaving. And that's where they're going to start their relationship. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's tricky. Yeah, health consultant comes in trying to make sense out of all of that, and hoping that they've been asked to come in when there's still something to build upon. Right. And when the relationship hasn't so deteriorated that it becomes very difficult to build upon anything. Mm-hmm. one of the things that I noticed a long time ago when I was doing mental health consultation is that, you hear all kinds of stories about children getting kicked out of school and preschool for all kinds of different reasons. But one story that I almost never heard was a story about a parent, about a child getting expelled from preschool when the parent and the teacher liked each other. I
Right.
just don't hear that very much. You know what I mean? If a
Right.
if a parent and a teacher seem to know each other and like each other, it's amazing how much that provider can put up with. But
Yes.
as long as it, but as soon as it gets to the point to where they think that the parent isn't trying,
Yes.
the parent is the cause,
Yes.
it's amazing how quickly we will punish that parent through that child.
Yes. I have heard and seen that reality, unfortunately. So this all of this is so complex. And I in your introduction, I talked about how your work is about helping to cultivate the most mental healthiness of environments, right? The what does that mean exactly to you? Whereas like when you're thinking about the context of all this, there's bias, there's all the and all the forms in which that takes. I think that there can be outright racism and discrimination that happens, and that's the part of consultation, is when we're creating these safe spaces, and we call them safe and brave spaces for these courageous conversations to happen, that it does bring forward where whether a parent or a teacher are actually able to say how they really feel, and we hold that that teacher will have something that they really feel negatively because of the race and their all of their perceptions of that race or their sexual orientation. And then you hear it back, on both sides, right? Like it's not just one, or the other. This is the complexity of what ends up happening when you just start conversations with people.
Yeah.
um, and we create the safety for those things to emerge. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, part of our work is how do we create conditions that are most optimal, first and foremost for the adults, for them to be mentally healthy and well, so that they then are able to then in turn create environments and conditions um, that are healthy and promote the well-being of every child. And so here's all this complexity, but what does that actually mean, um, when you describe it as having mentally healthy environments?
Well, I think you already answered it, Tina.
Mm-hmm.
All the
Okay.
things that you were describing right there.
Mm-hmm.
It's an environment that's conducive to, that's supportive of all the people who are in it. That means the children and the adults. I've never seen an environment that was mentally healthy for children that was mentally unhealthy for the adults.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be healthy for everybody. Children,
Mm-hmm.
you can't really separate children from the adults who are around them. And that
No.
means the parents, and when their parents are not there, it means the people who are standing in place of the parents, which are these providers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's got to be an environment where everybody feels like they're valued, their needs are being met, they're being heard,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is an acceptance of everybody that's there, and a desire to understand and hear everybody that's there, and all within the context of genuine interactions. Not a contrived sense of I am behaving this way with you because I learned in an in-service that I should behave
Mm-hmm.
this way with you, but rather I'm behaving this way with you because I feel it deeply inside me. That when we were first talking about this at the beginning, that hugging your child and closing her eyes because the love was so strong she couldn't keep her eyes open. That kind of stuff. And how do we either create or recreate or salvage or keep us from losing that kind of a relationship with the children. Because I think that's the relationship that childcare providers and teachers want. It's the only reason I can come up with in my own head as to why they would ever go into a field where they know they're going to get underpaid and under-respected. It has to be because they love it, or they knew that they would love it. They wanted to love it. They felt it in their heart. And I worry sometimes we just beat it out of them. You know, we teach them that the most important thing here is the curriculum. That the most important thing here is, you know, how the children behave, or the most important thing here is how they do on a test score. You know, instead of the most important thing here are the children. The children aren't here for the tests are here for the children. You know,
right.
And the curriculum, children aren't here for the curriculum. Curriculum should be here for the children. You know, and so, you know, if we end up focusing so much of our attention in education on the trappings of education, on all the decorations of education, that we lose track of the children, you know, then we kind of lost it all. I mean, that's really what it should be all about. It should be about how we feel about these children. And I worry that we get providers into this field who come into this field because of reasons in their heart, much more so than reasons in their head. And then in the field, we feed their head and starve their heart.
Wow.
We give them in-service.
Feed their head and starve their heart.
We give them tons of in-service trainings about what to think about and how to think about this issue, and how to think about curriculum, and how to do these different, without really spending a whole lot of time in any of this in-service trainings supporting how do you feel about this. You know, and that maybe part of the secret in mental health consultation, when a teacher tells us that they're at their wits' end, and like you were saying before, many of our teachers might feel, I don't know how to be helpful to this child. That maybe the first thing we need to do is we need to come in with some emergency first aid and show them all the ways that they actually are helpful to this child. Because I'm sure that they're doing a ton of things already. I know that when I was doing therapy more with parents and children, dyadic therapy, and the child come in, and you're working with the child and you're working with the parent too, and the parents are worried that they don't know what to do. And sometimes they're not enough. They might act like they're angry at the child, and in fact, you know, if you look a little deeper, you realize it's not really anger, it's fear, that they don't have enough of themselves to be able to help this child, that they don't know what's going to go on, that something's going to go wrong, and they'll have harmed their child. You know, that an awful lot of what's necessary is to help the parents be able to see that no matter what fear they have in them, they are the best thing this child's got going for this child, because you're their parent. You know, and finding some kind of a way to be able to build upon that. I mean, we can't help children except through helping them through the relationships that they have with the people in their lives, as their parents, their teachers, their pediatricians, you know, consultants. They don't do anything to work can help children directly.
Right.
You know, they help children by supporting those who have meaningful relationships in the lives of these children. And no one's going to have a more meaningful and longer standing relationship than that parent. You know,
and for those teachers where they have that child that is dropped off in their classroom, so at 7 a.m. in the morning, and is the last kid that's picked up at 6 p.m., right? Like they are that parent, that child's other parent, not just their teacher, right? So it's both.
Especially
it's really both.
Especially with really young children, you know, who, you know, look to parents. I early on in my career, when I was in graduate school, like over 25 years ago, and I was learning mental health consultation. And I was learning mental health consultation in Head Start classrooms. And I was there, and this was a Head Start classroom in a public school, and they had a cafeteria, and they took the children to the cafeteria to get some lunch. And there was this little girl. She was dark-skinned, African-American. Her father was black, her mother was black. and her father was in prison at the time. And we were there at the lunch line, and she reached up and grabbed my hand and said, "Hold my hand, Daddy." That
Mm-hmm.
whether we intend to be or want to be or see ourselves as the the local person standing in for the parent in this moment in the life of this child,
Yes.
whether we think we are or not, we
Mm-hmm.
are.
Yes.
And I already knew for a fact I did not look anything at all like her father.
Mm-hmm.
But I was dad enough then because
Mm-hmm.
she needed dad really bad then. And that doesn't make me dad.
Right.
It doesn't change the fact that that little girl felt the need
Right.
for a father figure then in the moment. And I wasn't it, but I was the best she had at that moment.
Right. So this is is bringing to mind when we're thinking about social emotional development and social emotional learning for children that one's racial identity is and having pride in that and being able to feel it in a positive way, right? And we sometimes think of that's the responsibility of the parent, right? And what actually came to mind when you were sharing that was that one way that a child, in an important way, gains a sense of self-worth and gains a sense of their identity and their sense of being good or bad in the world comes from how those adults, usually their primary caregivers, look at them, how they see themselves reflected in the eyes of their caregiver, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so um, when we have children of diverse backgrounds in classrooms where their primary caregiver, their parent in the moment, is not able, that child is unable to see them, or they see themselves in the eyes of that caregiver and all of who they are, black, brown, white, whatever. But what's being reflected back at them
Yeah.
is not one that is positive, right? And there's something super powerful about it's not always or just the words, right? But it is what they see in your eyes when you look at them.
Yeah.
And so when I think about, for all children, being able to see themselves in the eyes of their caregivers as being valuable, as being lovable,
Mm,
as having value.
mm,
When I think of when I think about how significant the learning environment is at home and at school and in a community, because when we are specifically zoning in on the big black boys, but we can say the big black girls too, like that if they're bigger and they're brown, that there are these expectations, right? You were sort of talking about um, the expectation that one has, but it's also how they're seen, right? Their sense of value. And so for African American children and children of color, they're already surrounded in an environment and a culture to where what's reflected back at them, especially now when if they're seeing these things happen in their communities, that the messages that are coming to them is that you are of no value. We can kill your father, we can kill your mother, and there is no consequence for that. There's no justice for that because there is a cultural message that's embedded that is the elephant in the room is that you don't have value. And so when I then think about how much, even more in our early care settings, that a consciousness around those messages and the messages that we then are conveying when that child sees themselves in our eyes, that white teacher, that Latina teacher, like any other teacher, or whether it's an African American teacher, but that all children are seeing the reflection of who they are in a way that they're seeing it, that they have value. And that part of the social emotional learning isn't just about that we have emotions, or but that I think that there's a piece of it is around how are we incorporating this piece around racial identity and the messages that are being conveyed um, unintentionally or implicitly in our classrooms. And so, for example, I've been listening to quite a few podcasts recently, and it's been talking about racial and social justice and early education. And there are voices that are calling for ECE systems to be revamped. And that for a range of reasons that teachers are ill-equipped to teach Black children, especially, but in general, children of colors, that there isn't a preparedness in their educational track around cultural sensitivity and equitable teaching practices, that there's a need for inclusion in our social emotional learning, that there is more around racial identity, and even being able to help children in their classroom to have pride in their own social racial community. And so that's like that there is this other piece that there's a gap in. So I just kind of wanted to like put that out there and just see, how does that land to you? What are your thoughts on that? Because there's just so much that's coming up in the dialogues around, and again, I think it speaks to the complexity of a mentally healthy environment, and this piece around racial identity and how that is supported or not supported in an environment. So yeah, I don't have an answer to it, and I'm not quite sure how that lands on you, but I'm just curious as I share that. How does that land on you, and what feelings and thoughts come to your mind?
Well, you mentioned a lot of important things, and one of them that you mentioned early on was this notion that children see themselves as reflected in the eyes of the people who are looking at them, and I suppose you could even maybe go as far as to say, that none of us ever really see ourselves. I can't really see me. I can just see my reflection, and when you're talking about young children, we see, young children see themselves as reflected in the eyes of the people who are caring for them and with them, and that becomes their own identity of who they are. But they also see how we treat and look at other people too.
Yes.
They don't, young children are incredibly good at that. When a young child, maybe like 12 months old, 18 months old, with a parent and a stranger comes by, and the child looks and sees the stranger, immediately the child's going to look at the parent. And they're looking at the parent to see how is that parent looking at the stranger. Because the child will take from that a cue as to whether or not this person they haven't met before is okay, is safe, is a nice person, not a nice person, scary person. Because children, they're not born knowing what to expect from the world around them. They need to take cues from the adults that they know and rely on. And they're really good at that, and we cannot lie to them, because they will watch our behavior really close. and learn from that whether or not this person we're looking at we think is an okay person. And then they'll take it on themselves. And so, I mean, there was a study that was done, I think it was 2018, and it was a study with childcare providers, and it was looking at the notion of whether or not biases can be caught like a virus in a childcare program. And they set it up in this very kind of interesting way where they had preschool age children watch videos. And in some of the videos, you have an adult interacting with another adult in a way that was very positive, and the person was leaning in and smiling as they were talking to the person. Or videos where the person was saying the exact same thing, but sitting back and had a much more neutral expression on their face, where it wasn't clear how they felt about the other person. And the other person in some of these videos were wearing a red shirt, maybe a blue shirt. And what they found was that whenever children saw positive behaviors being directed towards somebody, they felt that that person was a nicer person than if they saw negative behaviors directed. They didn't think that the person directing the behavior was nice or negative. They thought that the person their behaviors were directed towards were nice or negative. You know what? You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
All on the basis of just really subtle little interactions.
Yes.
But then and then they also even like had videos of the person wearing the blue shirt or the green shirt, trying to teach them some kind of task. And children even learned better and quicker from whoever they saw having positive interactions directed towards them. They just thought they were a nicer person. They said that they would rather have as a teacher. They have actually learned things quicker from them. But where it really gets fascinating is this. Then they showed the children lots of other pictures of other women that were in none of the videos. But some of them happened to be wearing blue shirts. Some of them happened to be wearing green shirts. And if the child was exposed to positive behaviors out of women wearing blue shirts, whenever the child saw another picture of a child that child had never seen before, who happened to also be wearing a blue shirt, they thought that that person was nicer and better than other people wearing other colored shirts. In other words, in just a few minutes with some videos, the experimenters created inside of preschool children a shirt bias. That these people are the nice people because of the color shirt they're wearing. And these people, not so much. And if we can do that over video in just a few minutes, imagine what could be accomplished in a classroom all year long in real life using something as pervasive as skin that you wear every day. You don't change you might change your shirt, but you don't change your skin. You know, and so the point that they were making there is that some of the times children can catch a bias really quickly and really easily, where we're not even anticipating that we're doing anything. You know, that some of the times the lessons that stick the most with children are the lessons we never intended to teach.
Teach them.
Just the things that they just observe, just on the basis of how we interact with children. I'll tell you a story of a child that I will never ever forget. When I first started working, like my background is in educational policy and early childhood policy and things like that, not as much in bias. I had to become better at understanding how to research bias because it was getting in the way of the things that I was hoping for children. Bias is the thing that sabotages our best efforts to do right and do good for all of our children, each and every one of our children. So I needed to learn more about it. And so I started working with people who do research in this area. And all of them have just been absolutely spectacular mentors to me. You know, it taught me an awful lot. But none of them more than this 10 or 11 or so year old girl that I'm going to tell you about. So I was at a conference, and it was a conference on bias and children. And I talked for a while about bias in educational settings. And then another person got up on the stage and talked to, this person was a court judge, and talked about bias in the court systems. and how that might impact decisions that are made about children. And then it was time for lunch, and we all got our lemon chicken because at a conference everybody eats lemon chicken. I don't know why, but it seems to be like the most popular thing to eat
Yes.
at a conference. And so it's either lemon chicken or salmon, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So I had my lemon chicken that day, and I was sitting there, and the MC at the conference came up onto the stage and brought with her a young black girl. And I don't know exactly how old she was, but I'm going to guess about 10, 11, 12, somewhere in that range. And she had her up on the stage, and she said to her, I didn't expect to see somebody your age here at the conference. This is wonderful. Why are you here? And I'll admit that I was surprised to see her. I was on the stage looking out at the audience. I didn't see anybody that I thought would be her age here. I thought everybody was, 30 or older or so, and so I was interested too. And she said, well, I came here with my mother. And the MC said, well, what did you notice? What did you hear in the conference that stuck with you? And she said, well, I remember when that professor guy talked about how teachers look at kids like me. I just got done talking about that eye tracking study that I was telling you about before. And I quit eating my lemon chicken, and I became, actually, I'll admit, I became a little afraid. I was worried. I was nervous because I was afraid that maybe I'd said something that would hurt her, that would change the way she saw teachers in school. I was afraid I might have hurt her. And I try to be aware when I'm having these kind of conversations that I'm talking about how we sometimes view children who don't look like my white daughter. But I usually am talking to adults,
Right.
and I just I hadn't really thought about it before, and so I became afraid. And then the MC asked the question that I wanted to know the most and was afraid of the most. And she said to her directly, and how did that make you feel? And then this little girl said something that I will never, ever be able to forget. She said, well, me and my friends, we already knew it. We just didn't think you all did. Our children see our behaviors, and they see our behaviors unfiltered by our intentions. They just see what we do. They don't see whether we intended to do that. They just see our behaviors. And if we treat some children differently than other children, they're going to see that. And if there's a pattern to it, they're going to see that too. They're going to pick up on it. And if something goes bang outside of our field of vision, and we're calling a child's name before we even turn our head, they're going to notice that too. And all of this teaches them something. It teaches our black children and our brown children and our white children, all of our children. It teaches them something about what it means to be one of the good ones versus the not so good ones. And that can be a lesson that gets learned in school too, as one of the lessons we maybe didn't really intend to teach, but it got taught anyway. I'm a firm believer that we need to have a teaching workforce that looks more like the children we serve. That we need to have a much more diverse workforce in early care and education, that we need to have more black and brown teachers and more men in the field that look more like the children that we serve and the diversity of the children. Thank goodness for all the wonderful, amazing white women who go into this field because they want to do good things for children. But the field is overwhelmingly white women, and we need more diversity than that, especially in some areas.
Right. What's really beautiful about Cadango, but I also think it inherently brings some complexity too, is we have this event, I think last year was the third or fourth year in a row, called Wellness Day. It's a wonderful thing that Cadango does. And part of so it literally, and we're a super large organization. So we have more than 600, about 600 staff, and 80-90% of that are teachers, and our classroom support staff. So you get to have all these people that come together, and we're in California, Bay Area,
Mhm.
and it was one of the most beautiful things, because literally it was every shade of color and culture that was represented, and it was really wonderful to see. And there's a sharing of there was a talent show, so there's a sharing of but this was all the adults, no kids, no kids were there. um and it was just really beautiful to see. And I think at Cadengo we're trying really hard and have been successful in many ways at creating that diversity um, that you were talking about. And yet, inherent in that is challenges, because there was every shade and every possible culture and different languages, which means the different biases um, are going to be, present there. So I think it's possible, but I also think in some ways geography, plays a role in that. But absolutely, what you were talking about is absolutely true. Um, so, what's the solution to this problem? Part of what and there's so many other things that we could have gotten to today in terms of like really trying to create the picture of the depth and the significance of the problem, because or else we can't create what we were talking about earlier, where there's like, okay, there's all this complexity, there's all these needs, and at the end of the day there are children that are being negatively impacted because of this, and we need to do something about it now. um, and so if bias is normal and racism is real, what is the hope for things to change for families with young Black, brown boys and girls? Um, and what do you see as solutions to what's a really complex um, scenario here? When you come to taking the broader world and saying, okay, here's our ECE system, here's our EC environments, and we know that all of these things um, are happening with, despite what you described and what I have seen and what you have heard too, is despite really good intentions.
Yeah.
What's the solution?
Or despite really good intentions in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to still admit that there are some instances where people don't have good intentions.
Very true.
But hopefully in the field of early care and education, that's not a field where most people who have overt racist desires want to gravitate toward. But I'm not going to rule that out, because sometimes you see all kinds of horrible things in all kinds of places. But I do think that for the vast majority of people in the early care and education field, they want to do what's right, and they care deeply about children. When we were doing that eye tracking study, at the end of the study, we had to tell the teachers the truth, that this was a study where we had to tell them something that wasn't completely truthful, that this wasn't really a study of how quickly you can find behavior problems. It was a study of bias, and in particular, your biases. And we had to give them the opportunity to either keep their data in the study or withdraw it. And I can tell you this, out of 135 providers that we collected data on, only one of them withdrew their data from the study after they found out what it was about. And that's a great thing, because it means that perhaps we've got a profession here who cares more about its babies than it does about its biases. It's willing to look at these things, and I think that's what we need to nurture. So when you were asking a question about, what do we need to do going forward to be able to help, I think part of it is find ways to get our field and the individuals within it more comfortable talking about this, more comfortable struggling with this, to not fall into the false trap of believing that there's one simple answer to it and that it'll all be done. It took us 400 years to get to this level of systemic racism in America. We're not going to solve it with one brave conversation. It's going to take an awful lot of them. And it's going to take an awful lot of concerted effort and struggle from a lot of us, talking about things that maybe make a lot of us feel very uncomfortable and for different reasons, and so I think part of it's going to be helping the field feel more okay having these uncomfortable conversations and realizing that this is going to be something that we're all going to have to wrestle with and struggle with. And that means sometimes struggling in front of our own children with it. That children aren't colorblind, because we're not either as adults. I see color. I think you see color. How do you celebrate something that you can't see? I don't want us to be colorblind. If colorblind means I can't celebrate it anymore. I can't see that diversity and think, wow, that's beautiful. If you're colorblind, also colorblind kind of implies, well, when we say color, we're not talking about white. Colorblind means I don't want to see that color. That's not a good message, is it? The whole concept, but the whole concept basically is rooted in the notion of maybe if we don't struggle with it, it'll go away. And that's not going to work. Anything worth dealing with is worth struggling with. And this is something that's real. And like you said before, biases exist and racism is real. And we're going to have to struggle with it. We're going to have to find ways to have conversations even that go to the level of, well, when we talk about diversifying the early childhood field and making sure that our classrooms look more like the children who are in it, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean hiring more assistant teachers of color? And if so, what does the relationship look like among the teaching staff? Do we get more white lead teachers and more assistant teachers of color whose jobs are to wipe the tables down? Or do we find ways to be able to have a more egalitarian, a more equitable way of interacting among all of the adults? Because the children are watching. It's not even just about how we treat them. It's about how we treat each other. They're going to see that. If we end up focusing on diversifying the field in a way that leads to more white people in charge of the curriculum and the instruction, and more teachers of color who are mostly responsible for cleaning the tabletops and setting out the meals, then all we have really accomplished is exposing our children to racially defined social hierarchies at an even younger age. But it's not just about the numbers. It's about how do we really, truly feel about this? And how committed are we? And we're only going to be able to go into something like that if we're able to have really deep conversations with each other and put race on the table and talk about it. If there was anything that I learned from that little girl in Las Vegas, Nevada, at that conference with the lemon chicken, it's that before I heard her, I had lots more anxieties in me about talking about this topic. I knew I needed to talk about it anyway. But the thing that I've learned from her is that I should not be as frightened to talk about this as I was. That's what she taught me. That's what she gave me. She taught me there very quickly that I'm not going to say anything that's going to surprise her. She already knew about this before I knew about it. And she will have known it and experienced it and felt it at a level that I cannot access because she lives it. The only thing that surprised her about what I said was not the findings. it was that somebody like me would care.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good surprise.
Mm-hmm.
I want her to have that surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's anything that I would point us to that I think would be the way forward, it's being courageous enough to have conversations that make us feel uncomfortable because we know we need to for our babies. And then
Yeah.
aside from that, things that bring adults together better, things that give an opportunity for families to see the teaching staff and the fact that the teaching staff have children too.
Mm-hmm.
Those barbecues and picnics and social
Mm-hmm.
events and talent shows and other things that bring the
People
families of
together.
providers and the families of the ones we serve together. Absolutely. All of that kind of stuff that humanizes us. It becomes a whole lot harder for us to do things that dehumanize each other if we've already humanized ourselves to each other
Mm-hmm.
by learning the stories of each other.
Right.
That,
And
that is
that's powerful. Yeah. So that is something, and we'll wrap up in just a second. So I see that like happening, and that can happen within an early child care center or an organization, like the teachers and the administrators at that level can certainly choose to have these conversations and to do these sorts of things. And then I'm thinking about the system as a whole, the ECE system and its responsibility to this, and having these conversations and having people of color also at those leadership um, positions and influence. Um, so, with all that you've seen, all that you've shared today, all that you've learned, and there would be perhaps one thing that you could change within our ECE system, and you had no limitations, what would be that one thing that you think the highest impact thing that would then trickle on down, right? Because we have structural racism, and we have um, structural and systemic kinds of practices and policies and ways of structuring our programs and funding our programs and all kinds of things, right? That might actually make it difficult for the teachers and the classrooms and the organizations in this community to maybe do as much as they would want. And perhaps that's my bias there. Perhaps I'm um, thinking about that, but I think that there's something to that in terms of the system as a whole. So what perhaps would be the one thing, if you could change about our system, that would create this equitable, um, healthy system, mentally healthy system? What would that be?
Wow, that's a great question, and I admire the fact that you took away all limitations, and that you don't even have to be able to fund it.
Mm-hmm.
that's,
Right.
that's the way that you
Right.
that's the way you were
Right.
saying it. So I think what it would be for me is to maybe back away from worrying so much about how many letters you know and how many colors can you name and how many shapes can you identify, and structure our early childhood system around forming solid relationships with families and getting to know that family and getting to know those parents, and then building our relationship with children off of that
Mm-hmm.
instead of building it off of some kind of curricular expectations. That we are here to support this family, and that before we came in to this role in early childhood education, the family was there. And when we leave this relationship with the child, the family will still be there. That we are here to serve this family. That's what I would hope to change the most with it. Finding ways to be able to create and restructure early care and education in ways where it's there to form a relationship deep from the very beginning with families.
will join you in that vision of
It used to be a lot more common
starting with that.
that
Yes.
early childhood care and education programs would do home visits and would meet with the families and get to know the family. And then after they met with the family and got to know them, then the child would enroll in the program. You know, instead of just seeing the early care and education program as largely a form of just child care. Instead, seeing this as a system that's joining with the family in order to be able to provide those kind of supports. You know, I think ultimately that's what we're going to need. And if we were better at that, then it would be harder for us to be able to harbor biases because we'd already know these families better and they would know us better. You know, and it's just so much harder to dehumanize somebody into categories if you already know them.
Yes, so true. So actually, one last question. So zeroing in on early childhood mental health consultation, which is near and dear to me. So same question. But if there were no limitations, what would be your vision and what would be your hope in terms of early childhood mental health consultation within ECE? I gotta put that in there because that is.
That's a great one. So I think what it would be is something very similar. But I mean, I have to also add in the fact that most programs don't have access to mental health consultation. Many child care providers, they don't have somebody who can provide them that kind of support. You know, so part of the solution is going to have to be making sure that our child care providers and our parents have access to somebody who can play that kind of a role and be there to be able to support the mental healthiness of this provider and the family. You know, but if there's anything that I could change about mental health consultation specifically, it would be to make sure that we forevermore do not see mental health as something we do to children, but rather as something that we do for children and all of the adults, providers and the families, all together. And we're there to support all of their health because we can't really be of any support to this individual child by ignoring all the adults that are wrapped around that child. You know, you had mentioned before about the way in which we view parents and how parents view providers and things like that. It reminds me of this one story. Like you've provided mental health consultation for many years, so you know that you have, when you do this kind of work, you get a lot of stories.
Yes, lots of stories.
Lots of stories. So here's a story from my experiences many years ago. There was this child who was in a child care program, and he was having a hard time walking. He just didn't walk early. He didn't even walk on time. He didn't walk late. You know, he was like, now we were like 16, 17 months, and he was still crawling. And there didn't seem to be any particular reason why he wasn't walking yet. Structurally, everything seemed fine. It seemed like he had good motor control. He just wasn't ready to walk, and it, and parents were reassured, everything seems to be fine, and the teachers were reassured everything seems to be fine. But of course, when it's your child or when it's a child that you care about in the child care program, you worry. Even if there's really no particular reason to worry, you just worry anyway, because we care so deeply about our children. And so here's this child who was late walking, and the parents were worried and the providers were worried. And one day the child took his first steps in the child care program. And I happened to be there, not in the room at the time, but nearby. And later on in the day, they told me how excited that they were, that they saw him take his first steps. And they were relieved that he took his first steps. And they were so thrilled, and they can't wait for mom and dad to be able to see that he's taking his first steps and everything's going to be okay. And everything. And so I took it as an opportunity, because they were all, the teacher, the assistant teachers, people down the hallway, everybody was just thrilled.
It was a celebration. Yes.
It was a central-wide celebration of this child taking his first steps. And so I asked the teacher, I said, so what are you gonna tell the parent? And she goes, oh, we're gonna tell her, you might want to watch real closely. I think he's getting ready to take his first steps. You see what I'm saying? I mean, they were so thrilled that they saw this child take his first steps. But they also realized the most important thing is for this parent to feel like they saw this child take his first steps.
I got chills.
That's what we're trying to build. That's what we're trying to build. This love for the child that flows through an embracing of this family, and love for this family. And it's very easy sometimes in the field of early childhood mental health for us to feel like we're there to save these children, to be messiahs in the life of these children, to be their saviors. And the problem with feeling like you need to be a savior is that, well, if you're the savior, who's your devil? And who have you made out to be the devil that you're saving this child from? And
yes,
that's the tricky part of doing this work. It's loving children and realizing that you can't really ever fully love them except through the families in which they live.
yes. Beautiful. So together, we are in partnership and a kindred spirit around how do we make that a continuous reality for every child, period. Thank you so much, Walter. It has been a wonderful conversation.
Well, I had a
I
blast.
look forward to more of these, whether it's part of the podcast or just when you and I have a chance to chat.
Yeah, let's do it again. Anytime that you would like to, my friend.
All right, my friend. You continue to be well. My regards to your family, and I hope you continue to take care and carry on in the work.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. You and your family too. Take care.
Thank you.
All my best to all my friends at Cadango.